Go for it.
Okay, we're good. Dr. Fauci, it's great to have you here with Reuters. It's Jeff Mason, White House correspondent, and Mike Ehrman. We miss seeing you in the press room. It's good to see you here. I'm going to jump right in with a question about the Sun Belt. Is your assessment, Dr. Fauci, that the Sun Belt states that are now hotspots, that they reopened too quickly? And do you think that they did because of political pressure?
You know, I can't answer the second part of the question. I think it's a variation, because some of the governors and mayors in those places actually declared the right pace, but the citizenry, if you look at what's happened in some of them, when you see people gathering, congregating, many without masks in crowded places. So there's two versions of that. Either the leaders of the states and the cities declared that you do it in a prudent, careful way, but the citizenry felt, you know, I'm just going to let it fly and do what I want to do. And in other cases, I'm not going to name anyone specifically, that states, I think, did not go by those checkpoints where you had the gateway, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, that we spoke about many times at the White House press conferences. I think that there was a bit of both of those things, which led to the surges that have occurred. Thank goodness now that people are pulling back and tightening up, and they're starting to turn around in several of those states. What we got to make sure we get careful is that other states don't repeat what happened there, because we really want to avoid any more of those surges related to not approaching the reopening process in as prudent a way as one should.
The president has obviously been eager to have states reopen. He said in a recent interview that the virus was under control, or at least as well under control as it can be. Is that an assessment that you would agree with?
Well, you know, it depends on what you're talking about. If you talk about, and I think what the president was referring to, he does, and you know, as the president wants to look at the brighter side of things. If you look at the curves of the states that were hot in the sense of surging, remember, we had a baseline, Jeff, of 20,000 cases a day. And that was a problem, because if you want control, you've got to get the base down way lower than that. So when you start off with a baseline of 20, 20, 20 over multiple weeks, then when you open up, whether you do it prematurely or you do it correctly, but some people don't abide by it, what you see is what we saw. Went to 40, 50, 60, 70, which was just not acceptable if you're trying to get something under control. It's starting to come back down now. So you're starting to see the curve go in the right direction. That's fine. But the thing that we've got to make sure of, that the reason why we want to absolutely get the public to appreciate that that doesn't have to happen when you try to open and get the economy back. You don't need to either shut down completely or let it rip, as I say. And I use that terminology when we were talking about that, you might remember, Jeff. There is a middle ground where you can prudently open. So I think the misperception among some is that either you're going to shut us down completely or we're going to do whatever we want. No, that was the reason for the guidelines of opening up the country. If you do it prudently, you don't have to shut down. And so what we're looking at now, and Dr. Birx has pointed this out correctly, that there are some states in that yellow zone, as it were, where they're just starting to have the inkling of a percent positive going up. So what we've got to do is make sure we don't let those little blips turn into surges. And, you know, I'll repeat here quickly, the 5 or 6 things that you do: wearing a mask consistently and properly, physical distance, avoiding crowds, stay away from bars and places where people congregate. Outdoors is always safer and better than indoors, and hand hygiene. That seems, Jeff, so simplistic, but it's true, because the states that have done that, Arizona went way up and they came right down by doing those simple things. And if everybody used that as kind of the guideline basic staples of what you do, we can avoid those surges and we could gradually progress towards opening the country.
And I remember those guidelines very well when you all were presenting them in the press room. And I know that the goal was to have the curve flattened in June. So I can't imagine that any of us imagined that the state of the pandemic would be what it is now in August. And I guess I just want to press you on that initial question. Is there any way that someone can describe this situation now as under control?
Well, the answer is obviously when you have 50,000 cases as a public health official, if you look at it in the big picture of things, even though there are some sections of the country that have done well, come down and are at a good baseline and are staying there. I think the confusing thing about the terminologies, Jeff, is that we're a big country. You can pick out some parts of the country that are looking good, and you could say it's under control. You could pick some parts of the country that are on fire in the sense, I mean, you're having outbreaks that, you don't get 70,000 cases a day when nothing's going on. So there is some good news there, and we want to emulate those areas that have been able to successfully contain it by doing the things that one needs to do to keep it down. And we know what they are. I just mentioned them.
Yeah, but it's not under control.
Jeff, the issue is you can hear what I'm saying. What I don't want is a soundbite that says one person says this, the other person says that. And the reason why is because then that distracts from the message that I'm trying to give. I mean, I've just been through this so many times. I don't want to get distracted by that. I just want to give the public health facts of what we need to do. We can reopen the country, reopen the economy without the extremes. We don't need to shut down, and we definitely shouldn't let it rip, as it were.
Dr. Fauci, you've expressed optimism about having a vaccine by the end of this year or early next year. What does that mean in practical terms? Do you expect a vaccine to be authorized by the FDA by then? And when would you expect it to be widely used across the country?
No, that's a good question. I do. When I talk about a vaccine that is available, I'm talking about something that has been proven in a randomized placebo-controlled trial to be both safe and effective. And right now, as you probably know, 2 of these in the United States went into phase 3 trial on July 27th. We're accruing patients in that right now. It's a prime boost. You give a first shot on day 0, 28 days later, a boost, and then it takes about 3 months to get people enrolled. If there are enough infections in the country, which there likely will be, apropos of what Jeff and I were just talking about, we're going to have infections in this country, you might likely get an indication that if it works and if it's safe by the end of this calendar year. I might add that I'm cautiously optimistic, though you can never guarantee things with a vaccine. I'm cautiously optimistic that we will have a vaccine that's effective enough to get approved, because the early studies in the phase 1 study showed that it induced the kind of neutralizing antibodies that were at least comparable, if not better, than what you see in convalescent serum. And that's a hallmark of a predictive quality that a vaccine might work. If that occurs, by the end of the year, we'll be able to have a vaccine. Now, the second part of your question is, when are you going to be able to get it in the arms? So the at-risk process is, even as we don't know yet whether it works or not, the federal government has invested hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars to make vaccine at risk. At risk doesn't mean at risk for safety, and it doesn't mean at risk for scientific integrity. It means at financial risk, because if the vaccine works, you've saved multiple months. If the vaccine doesn't work, you've lost a lot of money. But the government feels that even if you lose that, it's worth doing it to get a head start on the production. So we likely are going to have, maybe tens of millions of doses in the early part of the year. But as we get into 2021, the manufacturers tell us that they will have hundreds of millions and likely 1 billion doses by the end of 2021. So I think the process is moving along at a pretty favorable pace.
And there's concern among the general public that a vaccine's going to get introduced before the risks are fully known.
Right.
How will you know about potential long-term side effects, and how can you reassure the public that the vaccines are going to be safe?
Well, the decision is made by the regulatory agency, the FDA. As a scientist and someone who has been developing vaccines now for a considerable period of time, I would want to feel comfortable when I've had enough people in the trial that I get a good efficacy signal and a good safety signal. And that means you've done thousands of people and you don't see any unanticipated, unexpected, severe adverse events. You're going to get people that have minor things like pain in the arm and a little swelling. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about severe adverse events. When we feel confident of that, that's when I will feel confident that a vaccine is made widely available. Because one thing people sometimes forget, you give a vaccine to someone who's perfectly well that you're trying to prevent infection, which means you're going to be giving it to hundreds of millions of people. So you better be darn sure, A, that it's safe, and B, that it works. And that's the criteria that I use.
Which seems like a reasonable criteria. I know you've been asked, Dr. Fauci, about political pressure. Do you have any sense of pressure from the White House? Does the scientific community have any sense of pressure from the White House of wanting to announce a vaccine, say in October, before the election, to sort of help the incumbent President Trump's reelection chances?
Well, I'm certain of what the White House would like to see, but I haven't seen any indication of pressure at this point to do anything different than what we're doing. I mean, obviously they've expressed, gee, it'd be nice, the sooner the better, but I haven't seen any pressure to do something that is out of line to the regulatory. You know, it remains to be seen. As you get into the fall, there's going to be data accumulating, and people are going to be looking at the data. And at that point, there's going to be there's a data and safety monitoring board, Jeff, that monitors and looks at the data, so that if the data is so bad that you should stop the trial, they say stop. If the data is never going to get even dangerous, they'll say stop. If their data still needs to be accumulated, they'll say keep the trial going. If the data looks so good, they may say time out, approve it because it's so good. We're obviously hoping for the latter, but you're going to have an independent crew to determine, is it futile that you'll never get an answer? Is it dangerous to stop? Should you keep it up, or should you stop because it's really good news? Those are the four options that the Data and Safety Monitoring Board looks at.
And I'm sure you're right that the good news would be helpful if it were timed for mid-October.
Right. Yeah, we have assurances, and I've discussed this with the regulatory authorities, that they promise that they are not going to let political considerations interfere with a regulatory decision. Because we've spoken explicitly about that, because the subject obviously comes up. And the people in charge of the regulatory process assure us that safety and efficacy is going to be the prime consideration.
There's obviously a lot of interest in a vaccine for public health reasons as well as political. But realistically, even with the timeline, the optimistic timeline that you've mentioned, how long are we as a country and we as a world going to be dealing with this virus?
Well, it's going to depend very heavily on the degree of efficacy and availability of a vaccine. Historically, if you get a vaccine that has a moderate to high degree of efficacy, and you combined with that prudent public health measures, we could put this behind us. I don't think we're going to eradicate this from the planet, Jeff, because it's such a highly transmissible virus that seems unlikely. But what I think we can do with a combination of a good vaccine and attention to public health measures, and by attention, I don't mean shut down. I mean things that are just prudent, that I think we can get this behind us. We may need to go through a season of it, and then by next season, if we have a vaccine, it won't be a pandemic. It won't be immobilizing the world. It won't be destroying the economy. But if we can get it to the point where we bring the levels so far down, then there would be very unlikely we would have to be concerned about it. I think I think we can get there.
Is that realistic to think that that could happen in 2021, or is that likely to go further into 2022?
You know, Jeff, I mean, the one thing that as a scientist I always have to do, despite the bobs that are thrown out at us, that I'm not going to give you a declarative statement of something that I'm not sure of. I don't know. I hope and feel it's possible that by the time we get through 2021 and go around for another cycle, that we'll have this under control. Is it conceivable that we won't? Of course. I would be unrealistic to say that. Do I think we're going to have a much, much better control one full year from this winter? I think so.
Dr. Fauci, some scientists have criticized the U.S. vaccine portfolio as relying too heavily on technology platforms, new ones like mRNA, that can produce vaccine candidates quickly, but are less proven. What do you say to that? And what happens if Moderna's candidate doesn't succeed? Are there other vaccines in the U.S. lineup that you're particularly that you think have the best chance for success?
You know, Mike, that's a great question, and it's one that people ask all the time. What we've done, we being the federal government, the combination Operation Warp Speed, Active, the NIH, CDC, FDA, what we have done is make a major government investment of resources into multiple companies at different levels. In some, we've actually helped develop the vaccine, like Moderna. In some, we've provided important information for them, like Pfizer. In some, we've provided our clinical sites that they could use that we've developed over decades. In others, we've made advanced purchases. So the federal government has put their more than one egg in a basket. So you have the platform technologies that allowed us very rapid entry into the vaccine development. That was the mRNA of Moderna. Then you have the other ones that have different platforms. Then you have the classic ones that we know a lot about, the typical recombinant proteins. We've made investments in all of them. The reason we use some of the more modern technologies is it was very well adapted to rapidly getting into a clinical trial. And the rapidity was not at the expense of safety or scientific integrity. It was pure technological advance. And you know the story. I went through it at many of the press conferences we had. The sequence was known on January 10th. I called a meeting of my staff on the 11th. We got the sequence and put it into the platform in collaboration with Moderna. 5 days later, we had a clinical trial, phase 1, 62 days later. Normally, that process would have taken years. So the technological flexibility of that platform was the reason we did it. We didn't abandon investment in several other platforms, including viral vector, including recombinant protein. We have a pretty comprehensive portfolio that's going to subsequently be going into clinical trials.
And any of those that you're particularly enamored of?
You know, the answer is no. And because if I said yes, then I would be skipping over the clinical trial. The proof of the pudding, Mike, is what happens in a clinical trial. And that's the reason why you've got to have a randomized placebo-controlled trial. One vaccine over the other will give you maybe a little bit more neutralizing antibodies, maybe more T cells, maybe better duration. All of them look pretty good. The proof of the pudding is the randomized placebo-controlled trial. You know, there's a lot of things that we never had any experience with comments that go viral. We try to pay very little attention to that. I mean, it's no news to anybody that there have been things said about me from within the White House that I found that weren't particularly helpful, as it were. So what we try to do, maybe some can do it better than others, is to focus like a laser on what we're supposed to be doing, getting this epidemic under control, and not listening to the kinds of comments that can be distracting.
Do you think science is leading the charge, or do you think politics is leading the charge?
Well, with what we have to do, science is certainly at the table. And when you have a lot of other considerations that authorities talk to and listen to, that gets all put in the mix. The one thing I'll guarantee is that the public health and the scientific data and information that I and my colleagues give, and I can speak for them, is based on fact and based on evidence. And the thing about science that is an interesting component of all of this is that we're dealing with a moving target. This is uncharted territory. Remember, Mike and Jeff, 6-7 months ago, we were celebrating New Year's and not worrying about this. And now all of a sudden something comes along that we've never had experience with. So what you look at and see in January, from a scientific standpoint, you've got to act with policy and recommendations based on the data that you have at the time. If it were a static situation that didn't change, then what was true here would be true here. But when you have a moving target and you gain more information as the weeks and months go by, you've got to be transparent enough and humble enough and honest enough to say, this is different than what we realized 2-3 months ago. So we need to make some course changing. That's not bad science, guys. That's good science. Namely, act on the data that you have at the time and be flexible enough to change things based on new data as it accumulates.
Do you think other countries follow the data more closely, or how would you explain why the US is not doing as well as many of its international peers?
Well, I think there was more of again, first of all, the answer to your question, Jeff, would take more time than we have on this interview. It's very complicated. But one thing that appears to me that I'm looking at this and in some respects obsessing over it every single day, because that's what I do, is that we have somewhat of a disjointed approach to things based on that. Please don't make that a soundbite. Based on the fact that we have a big country that's really very, very different in demography, different in level of infection. We have a broad population that is the young people who can get infected and think that, in fact, it doesn't have any impact on them, when in fact, they are part of the propagation of the outbreak. And yet it's very difficult to get a cohesive message when you have some people who do well and don't even get symptoms, and some people who die from this. So unless everybody is on the same wavelength and saying, we're all going to do this the same way, we're all in this together. And obviously, if you look at what's going on, like it or not, we see in our own country a great diversity of the way people approach things, a great difference in the seriousness in which they take it. Whereas if we had a uniformity of it and everybody rode together in the same boat, we probably would do much better. But, the typical thing, masks for a while became almost a political issue. There were people who were making statements about whether or not they were wearing a mask. That's not good when you're in a pandemic and you want everybody to do the best public health things. Thank goodness that's changed, because now the message about masks is very clear. So I'm very pleased now that we're seeing the vice president consistently wearing a mask, the president tweeting that you should be wearing masks. that's a good thing. That's a step in the right direction.
And every little step helps. We have run out of time. So Dr. Fauci, on Mike's and my behalf and all of Reuters, thank you so much for this interview, and we look forward to talking to you again.
I hope so. Thanks, Jeff. Thanks, Mike.
Yeah.
Good to be with you.
You too.
Thank you.